introduce our special guest for us.
All right. So everyone meet Dr. Cassidy. Some of you may follow her on Instagram and you're on TikTok now too, right?
Here and there.
Dabble. TikTok's a scary place, man. So
Yeah.
you gotta you gotta be careful. Dabble, but she has an incredible so Dr. Cassidy is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She has an incredible podcast called Holding Space. I've been on there a few times. And we both live in San Diego, so have, our friends and colleagues, and she's just an incredible resource. And she's sh- her you'll see her responses are so she's one of those people who's so thoughtful, and I always appreciate that about you, Dr. Cassidy, because I feel like I'm just always like I just say what's on my mind, and then you're like, well, let's like, I love your thoughts. So just incredibly thoughtful. And I'm so glad that you're here because when we decided we wanted to do this series, we wanted to, have these conversations about feeling anxious and having stressful thoughts. We wanted to have that conversation to one, of course, we want to destigmatize these things because it's so common in the reproductive journey, all of the brain changes that are going on, everything that's happening with us. There's so many things to be worried about. And at the same time, destigmatize, but also not over normalize, which I feel like happens
Mm,
a lot,
mhm.
where we take things that, oh, because everybody experiences that means it's normal. We don't need to do anything about it. So one, destigmatize without normalizing things that are actually need attention, and then also talking about practical things that we can do in these really difficult moments
Mm.
where we feel like we're kind of stuck in these thoughts or having these thoughts. And you're the perfect person to do it, so thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I could talk about this all day, and I do as a therapist in private practice. I do talk about this stuff all day, but it's really fun to be in the position to um, be in conversation and kind of look at it from this perspective of, okay, let's get some education, let's get some tools, and let's try to reach a broader audience about this, because I think that the more and more we can do that, the more folks might take the step to ask for more help, and actually be able to use some tools in the process as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And what do you think about the prevalence of anxiety and fears and worries during from trying to conceive all the way through, having little kids and giving birth? You know, it's interesting. I think that a lot, people come into the reproductive journey having, anxiety or not. And then, it seems like it's really primed for us to experience a lot more anxious thoughts, but we're not necessarily diagnosing more anxiety disorders in
Mm,
pregnancy than outside of and during the reproductive. And I
mhm,
think, I mean, my perspective on that is that we're just really underdiagnosing.
mhm.
I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, that's my thought too. And what you said earlier in terms of not over normalizing this, like being able to kind of identify that, okay, the truth of the matter is that when you are navigating fertility, pregnancy, and postpartum, and that period of your life, the chances of you having an uptick in intrusive thoughts, anxious thoughts, very it's very likely, right? Like a
Yeah.
lot of people do this. So meaning if you experience that, there's nothing wrong with you, like there are other people, that you're not alone in this, like there's support out there. And I think that sometimes that message can also make folks feel like, okay, well, then I guess this is just my new normal. This is my
Right.
life now, where, right, like, yes, there can be an uptick and you might still be functioning, right? And so just sort of knowing that, like, okay, when I'm having these thoughts and I'm like, whoa, that was a scary thought. I'm not used to
Yeah.
having like these intrusive thoughts pop up, or like I'm worrying more now, right? Like I never used to be an anxious person. I'm more of an anxious person, to be like, okay, like now I have some context for why. But if it's impacting your functioning, like you deserve help and you can feel better, right? And
Yeah.
even if you're like, well, I don't know if it's impacting my functioning, you can get some help and you can still
In
feel
answering
better.
that question,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
do think I will say I do think that we really, we tolerate a lot before we will
Oh,
action.
yeah. I'm always actually so amazed at how much oh, the human person can tolerate in
Yeah,
terms of stress and, and distress. And it doesn't mean that that's okay, right? Or that that's how it needs to be.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that we've so it's so it makes so it's so logical to have fears and worries and anxieties during this period of our life
Mm.
that it's almost because it's logical, we say, okay, well, it makes sense. And it's only when it's like, well, this is out of proportion, right? It's this
Mm.
idea of, is my fear, anxiety, worries proportional? Is
Mhm.
that, I mean, is that how therapists make assessment of whether somebody is anxious or not? Are they looking at, well, your life is anxiety provoking, so that's a proportional response. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. So, I think some more context might be helpful here. That right, I think for a very long time in our society, nobody was talking about anxiety, right? And so, I know for instance, my mom, right? Like she has we all have anxiety, and her anxiety can sometimes impact her functioning, but when she was a young mother, that was not no one was talking about postpartum anxiety, let alone anxiety really in general.
Okay.
And then I think, the pendulum swung, and as it oftentimes does, and we were talking a lot more about it, and now it's sort of this like a lot more folks can understand this piece that like, okay, we are actually all wired for anxiety. Like anxiety, we've got the movie Inside Out 2 now
Yes.
with the anxiety character, and we're our kids and we as adults now and parents are watching this like, oh yeah, there is just this part of me, we all have it, and its job is to look for all the potential threats, right? And it turns on that same response that fear does when
Mhm.
there is an imminent threat, right? That fight, flight, freeze. There's also fawn and flock response. And so when somebody comes in and they say to me or to a mental health clinician, I have anxiety. Like, the I wouldn't say this, but the first response is like, you sure do, and so do I. Like we all do. This is something that we are all wired for. But then what I am deeply curious about is to better understand their relationship with that part of them
Okay.
and the role that that part of them has taken on in their life, right? Because that part, it's a protector part. We do all have it. But yes, whether it's our situation, whether it's uh, predisposition, right? Whether it's a trauma, whether it's circumstances, like there are times when that part of us learns or believes that it needs to step into this more extreme role,
Okay.
and that can begin to impact our life in a variety of ways, right? So we're asking about symptoms, we're asking about their functioning, and the way that I like to really work, because I really do think that this resonates with people, because I could be like, how's it affecting your functioning? What are your symptoms? But if
Yeah.
I ask them like, tell me about your relationship with this part of you, like when does this part of you like get triggered
Yeah.
throughout the day, like what does this part of you lead you to do, right? Like just really getting into understanding that those thoughts in their head and the
Yeah.
behaviors that kind of follow those thoughts, and already from the beginning to separate, like there is you, there's yourself, right? The part of you
Yeah.
that can be curious and compassionate and right, like creative, and can have that space between the self and these parts. Then there's that part of you, and I just want to understand more about, give that part of you a chance to speak up so we can hear it out,
Yeah.
and then we start to explore, right, like maybe a diagnosis, or just some tools to getting back in the driver's seat of their life.
I mean, I think that's a tool in and of itself, right? Is
Oh yeah.
identifying the 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 anxious part of you as this, this almost a separate entity. And I do think that
Yeah.
like this, I don't know if y'all, if you haven't seen Inside Out 2, I feel like it's such a it's a really beautiful depiction, I think, of the scene where there's a panic attack. If you've ever had a panic attack, it's like it resonates very deeply. But I do think that that's a way of separating yourself from the experience of the anxiety, right? And understanding, okay, that's an aspect of me. And I love how you talk about um acknowledging these different, I've heard you talk about, acknowledging these different parts of ourselves and embracing them. Can you talk a little bit about what that means to embrace something that may be, you know, really making life difficult sometimes?
Yeah. 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 I really think that in so for example, in this work with the client, you're right. This is actually a huge intervention, is just beginning to kind of look at it as a part of us, right? Even just using that language, even just in the framing of a question. So like when anxiety gets in the driver's seat, or like, what is anxiety whispering to you right now? Or like,
Yeah.
what is like, we'll sometimes do even some visualization around, can you tell me what this part of you looks like, right? How old
Yeah.
is this part of you, right? And, you know, I think initially folks, you might like, I know as a therapist, I was like, oh, this is going to feel weird for people, but like people really can do this like pretty easily. Be
Yes.
like, oh, like this part of me is a like drill sergeant, or this part of me that just looks like a very like a frazzled version of myself, or this part of me is like a much younger version of myself that like had to learn really early on that we need to be hyper vigilant to like keep
Yeah.
us safe, right? Or and then there's other other parts of us that can befriend our anxiety, or even take on the role of protecting our anxiety. So like perfectionism, really, perfectionism is just that part of us that has shaved legs and like perfectly coiffed hair and has all of our shit together and
Yeah.
is like steps in front of anxiety and is like, don't look too close,
Yeah.
because if you look too close, you will see that there is a very frazzled part of me
Yes.
behind me freaking out about how really it's about vulnerability, how vulnerable things
Right.
feel now that I am trying to conceive, or that I am expecting, or that I'm postpartum, or that I'm a parent. Don't look too close.
Yeah.
Stay back. I've
Yeah.
got it. I'm all good.
Yeah.
If I can achieve perfection, then maybe I'll be safe, right? So it's really about vulnerability and about safety. And as we begin to have these conversations about the different parts, it's really cool to see how this comes forward for folks. Now, it's this parts language has roots in what's called internal family systems, and
Yeah.
it's a widely used therapeutic approach that I integrate into my practice, whether I'm using EMDR or another evidence-based approach that addresses the thoughts, and values specifically. Bringing in this kind of parts language just has a way of folks, I really think, beginning to see, oh my gosh, I'm not just an anxious person, or
Yeah.
a greedy person, or a shameful person. Like I'm a person who has these parts of me that
Yeah.
carry shame, or that worry about all the potential threats, or that sometimes, puts myself first, right? That selfish part of me, right? But along with those, there's also the part of me that's generous, and the part of me that's playful, and I have all these different parts, and sometimes they take on extreme roles. Sometimes it's they relate to each other in ways that make our lives complicated, but there is still a self. And what people begin to see in that is it's almost like this like parent relationship with a child,
Mhm.
and like this part of you just needs to be heard and validated and seen, and then sometimes needs some boundaries, right?
Yeah.
Like needs to know that you're in charge and that you've got
Yeah.
this, but that you're also listening, right?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, I think what our parts are really, that really what they're core job is to just give us data about what's
Yes.
happening around in the world around
Are
us
you
to keep us
sure? Are
safe.
you sure you didn't see this threat? Because you have not
Yeah.
acknowledged that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
been warning you
I've been warning you, like that
all day,
stomach
but now
ache.
you're trying to go to sleep, and now you'll finally listen to me.
Yes. Now that there is not a more stimulation,
Yeah,
right when your head hits the pillow.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Talk to me. You use this beautiful metaphor about driving
Oh
and
yeah.
leaving parts of ourselves in the car. And I think that again, um, being able to, visualize or kind of, anthropomorphize these elements of ourselves, I feel like can be really helpful. Can you talk us through the car?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I love that this movie Inside Out 2 is out now, because it gives people something kind of a quick reference point now for when I give this metaphor to clients. But I also always often want to say, like, now that we have this reference point, it's also important to kind of be able to pause and be like, well, wait, actually, what does this part feel like? Or what is this for me? Right? Because we
Yeah,
all, while there are these very common threads of these parts of ourselves and these core human emotions, all of our experiences are very diverse and unique. And so to kind of honor the nuance of that too is important. So here's how the metaphor goes. And the roots of this metaphor were pulled from Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic, integrated with an evidence-based approach in therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy that, talks a lot about values and about kind of creating this diffusion between yourself and this part of you. So I always like to give a little bit of context just so that people
yeah,
are like, where are you pulling this from?
yeah.
Like there's research there, there's a reason for this. And all these ideas originate from all these brilliant minds coming together. So
Yeah.
let's imagine you're going on a road trip. Okay. And it's the road trip, we'll make it real cheesy. It's the road trip of life, right? Or it's the road trip of conception, or the road trip of your pregnancy, or the road trip of becoming a parent or parenthood. And you get in the car, and before you can take off, your passenger door opens, and in comes in joy and curiosity and compassion and calm. And you look to these parts of yourself and you're like, I am so glad you're here,
Yeah.
because like you are going to make this journey really meaningful. But before we can leave, the back door opens and in comes in, creeping and crawling, these other parts of ourselves that are inevitably going to pop along for this journey. And that's our fear and anxiety and perfectionism, our guilt, our shame, our comparison, our jealousy, our anger, our rage. And there tends to be a couple different ways that people respond to these parts of ourselves when they show up. One is like pedal to the metal, crank up the music, like horse blinders on. I'm just going to white knuckle and pretend like
Mhm.
it's not there, right? And I I've white knuckled before. I think we all have. There have been the moments where I'm just like, I don't have the space for this right now. And then of course, the minute I get some space, my like immune system like
Yeah.
shuts down. I get sick and it's
You're
like,
like, and now you are very, very ill. Yeah.
right, right. And we it's this is the white knuckling, the avoiding, right? This can also look like numbing, right? Or I've had those moments where something's going on and I escape to the bathroom and I turn on my phone and I just try to scroll and
Yeah.
pretend like
Romance
it's
novels, you pick your poison.
oh, there's so many ways, right, to
So many
avoid
ways.
those parts of ourselves. But
Yeah.
here's the thing is that we can only do that for so long, right? We can only hold these parts of ourselves at arm's length for so long until they're like, she's not listening. Like, I have important data, right? Like,
Yeah.
anxiety is like, there's all anxiety is like there's all these potential threats that like you are not listening to, right? Or guilt is like you are screwing up your kids and like, or you are not being present, or you are doing these things and you're not paying attention, right? Or
Yeah.
anger is like you're really gonna let like these people in your life continue to walk all over you, right? Like, so
Yeah.
all these parts of us, they've got important data, right? I
Yeah.
mean, their delivery isn't always so helpful, and
Yeah.
sometimes when they jump in the driver's seat, not so helpful. But we can only avoid for so long until they just keep getting louder and louder to the
Yeah.
point where we can't ignore it anymore. And then this is what can happen. And some folks just go straight to this, which is like slamming on the brakes. Now you're in park. So it's like you
Yeah.
can't, it feels like you can't move forward in your life. You feel stuck. You feel consumed by, you're turned around, right? And like,
Right.
you know, this is when like the thoughts are swirling and you're just kind of in that spiral. And here's the other cost is that for both of these, all the energy it takes to just white knuckle through keeps us distant from our other passengers, like
Yes.
joy and compassion and creativity. And when we're in park and we're turned around, it's hard to engage with those parts of ourselves. Sometimes those backseat passengers are like, you know, scooch over, like I'm going to take the wheel, right? And that's when we find ourselves feeling driven by anger,
Yeah.
right? When I lose it at my husband, or when, I send the like, or scream at my kids or yell at the dog, or, anxiety can jump in the driver's seat and like keep me from doing things that are actually a meaningful risk. And anxiety is like, oh, like it's risky, but now I'm not even maybe like putting myself out there to ask for help or to make a friend or to make a connection, And so, yeah, a lot of people can relate to this. I think every human being that I've shared this metaphor with is like, oh, yep, I relate to this part or that part, or like I white knuckle until like, then I'm stuck, or I just like, I go straight to just like feeling really stuck, or I've been stuck for a while. And so then the question is, so what do we do with this, right? And really what we've been talking about up until this point is the work, is about getting in the car and like actually like fully accepting that these are all parts of you that are coming along for the journey. And sometimes they're going to pop up and they're going to be offering data that we're going to take a moment to pause, create some space there to just be like, okay, wait, what's actually happening right now? What's the data that anxiety is giving me or that guilt is giving me? Is this helpful? Is this actually aligned with something that is important to me, like a value? Is this going to help keep me safe? Is it a meaningful risk or a really dangerous risk or actual risk? So, sometimes that's tricky to work through because we have a lot of history with these parts of ourselves. Sometimes these parts of ourselves are stuck back in the 80s or 90s, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and they don't realize that we're the adults now and we have more agency or safety, right? So sometimes there's trauma work that we can do around that to process and kind of restore these memories. I use EMDR in my practice for that to support. And and then we also tend to do a lot of work around values, because if I'm in the driver's seat and I'm not going to let anxiety jump in the driver's seat, how
Yeah.
do I know? Like, how do I know when like there's a decision to make and anxiety is giving me data and I'm like, okay, there's the data about, this risk factor, or, this appointment or this information I was given or this decision. Here's all the data. And now I want to actually turn to my GPS, and my GPS could be my values, right? And you and I have talked about this plenty when we've talked about our birth experiences and birth plans, and how at the end of the day, with my second and my third, so different from my first birth, because I actually just did a lot of work around my values to help guide my decisions, right? Because there was so much that I knew was going to come up that I wasn't going to be able to anticipate. But if I knew what my values were, when anxiety popped up and said something about this feels threatening, I could take that data, maybe ask a question to get more information, and then turn to my values, whether that's a value of safety or a value of connection or a value of presence, to help kind of guide what I want to be aligned with in this birth, rather than anxiety jumping in the driver's seat. Yeah. So it's really at the core, it's the work is developing a new relationship with anxiety, and one in which it you have compassion for this part of you. You are understanding it has an important job, and also reclaiming the reins of your life,
Yeah.
where you have processed some of the triggers and trauma. You understand what your values are and feel kind of rooted in those, and that can allow us to begin to respond, with more intention when things are inevitably triggering, because that will happen again.
Yeah. You said something that I wanted to kind of pull out for people when you are white knuckling things and avoiding, right? Avoiding some of the anxious thoughts and everything. You said you're not able to pay attention to like the joy and the curiosity and all of that. And I think that's a really it's such an important thing to realize about our brains is that, we're not really able to kind of selectively numb, which wouldn't that be so
Totally.
lovely
It'd
if
be
we
so
could?
nice. Yeah.
We're not able to selectively kind of tune out. So that means that, if you have, a lot of the ways that we solve problems as human beings, even if we don't think about it as being a creative endeavor, is
Mhm.
with our creativity, is with thinking
Totally.
like, you know what, maybe I should I I seem to be getting anxious a lot when I go on social media. Maybe I need to have like a boundary with I don't go on social media after 4 p.m. That's
Mhm.
creativity right there, right?
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
when we are, you have to kind of, you have to accept and approach the anxiety and the anxious thoughts to
Mhm.
be able to work with them. Because
Mhm.
so often, and I get these messages, and I'm sure you do too. It's like, how do I not worry? So the
Yeah,
goal is like kind of is like, how do I shut this down? Because everybody wants to shut it down.
of course.
It can, I don't know. I'm
It
curious what you think about that.
Yeah, and then unfortunately what can happen is it can actually backfire and intensify because, just like with a young child, when when I tell a young kid who's worried about something, right? Like, don't worry, or like stop worrying, or like it's not a big deal, or like you're gonna be fine, or you're fine, you're fine, you're fine, right?
Mhm.
And what a child and what we, because we were the children once too, like what we learned and what a child learns is that like, oh, I have to like either two things. Either my body must be wrong and I can't trust my body because you're telling me I'm fine, even though something inside feels like it's not. And so I can't trust myself. Again, the self now being something that I can't trust. Or I just need to get louder, like, and
Yeah.
and I think that eventually, kids become adults that learn like how either I can't trust myself, or right, like, or these parts of myself need to get really really loud in order for it to be heard. And these parts of us are taking all those experiences now into our adulthood, right? So
Yeah.
we have this like conflict of feeling like I don't know if I can really like trust my parts, but
Yeah.
also the more I don't listen to them and ignore them or try to avoid it, the louder it gets because
Yeah.
they're they're getting into these extreme roles because they don't feel like we're paying attention, right? And so it's it
And
creates
then
this
there's the
like
shame that comes with that, right? Because
yeah,
then there's the shame of I should be especially when it's like, something that happens in pregnancy or postpartum. I should be enjoying this. I should be grateful. And I'm just worried and scared. And
yeah,
what's wrong with me? Yeah.
yeah, right, exactly. And I I truly I love this work so much. I love sitting with somebody and being the person to kind of do this guided work that has evidence around it to support somebody in identifying not just what these different parts of them are, but
Mhm.
what the stories are that these parts of them have been carrying for so long.
Hold on.
And to be in a position to then process those things, right?
Yeah.
And there comes this like moment where these different parts of the moms that I'm working with, this point where they're like, wait, hold on, like it's 2024 now. Like I'm 30 something years old. I am an adult. I have agency, right? Like I don't I actually now have the tools to respond to these in a different way, and I have the power to like have boundaries and to protect my peace, right? And to show up for my kids in the way that I always needed when I was
Yes.
learning about these different parts of myself and what they meant in the world. And there's like this beautiful, it's brutal too, but like brutal, beautiful, beautiful, like the process of being able to show up for our kids in the way that like these parts of us have always needed, and these parts get to witness that. And so this like process healing gets to be this like parallel process, right? Like you don't have to wait to be fully healed, right? Like along the way, you're going to make mistakes. It's actually part of it. It's actually a beautiful thing for kids to learn that, like, oh, I don't have to be perfect because you're not either. And you're
Yeah.
apologizing to me consistently
Every day, all
every
day.
day, multiple times a day, in my home. But yeah, so yeah, it's really meaningful work, and you can live with anxiety in a way that doesn't have to be so scary because
Yeah.
during pregnancy and postpartum, and maybe you could speak to this too from the research and work that you've done. The brain changes, and from an
Oh,
evolutionary perspective, it makes so much sense, right? Like, you are now in a vulnerable position. Our
mhm.
ancestors were in a vulnerable position when they
Yes.
were trying to conceive, when they were pregnant, when they were postpartum. And our ancestors who survived were the ones who were more likely to figure out what the potential threats were, right?
And at night,
And at
they were
night,
vulnerable at
especially.
night. They were
Yeah.
very vulnerable after giving birth. And they were you then have to restructure your entire perspective on keeping safe. There's now a person,
Yeah.
right, there that you have to prioritize even above your own safety, which is a huge rewiring of the brain that has to
Absolutely.
happen. And so when your brain is rewiring, I mean, it's an uncomfortable experience. And this starts, I really think we start rewiring our brain from the very beginning of when we start trying to conceive, because all of the sudden we're like, wait, can I do that? Can I
Yeah.
should I do that? Whatever. So we're starting this rewiring process so
Yeah.
early.
Can I ask
And
you a question? Because I haven't seen the research on this, but I have a 13-year-old now who's got her period. So she's in the early stages of this part of her life as a woman. And, I am no longer trying to conceive and outside of that, but now I have a more of a regular period. There was a while there where I didn't, a lot of babies there and breastfeeding and such. So there are certain times, like right before my period, where I feel like that uptick in anxiety and that kind of like on edge, like fight response. Like, I will fight you, like, if you come near me.
yes,
And and
yes.
and a part of me was wondering, like, from like evolutionary ancestral like legacy perspective, like, because I'm bleeding, or I'm about to start bleeding, and like that might have been a potential threat for my ancestors, right? Who
Yeah.
were bleeding out, right?
Yeah.
And like the saber-toothed tiger, I don't know, could like smell the blood, and that was dangerous. So they were more on edge, hyper vigilant, having more anxiety, more potential anger and rage. Is that part of this too? Because
It
I'm like,
could I mean, it's listen, we see that in the data that that's very much there, like
yeah,
increased irritability, increased anxiety during the second half of the cycle. And also remember, it may also be part of you could also be pregnant, right? And
yeah,
so it may be saying, okay, this is a period in time which we could be pregnant. So let's just be a little bit more fierce and a little bit
mm.
less trusting and
Yeah,
all of that, right? I mean, yeah, I think that one thing that I think is really nice, I think that as we learn more about the brain and as we learn more about ourselves, we put so much blame on ourselves, right?
mhm,
And like,
mhm.
oh, well, I shouldn't be anxious. I shouldn't feel this. I shouldn't have rage or any of these parts. And understanding that this is all actually anxiety and anger and all of these things have an important role to play in our survival as a human
They do.
species, and
Mhm.
our like us, the person, gets to like again, the way that you talk about anxiety being something that you can kind of personify as outside of yourself. So you have these anxious thoughts and you can say, "Oh, hi," whatever you want to call that part of yourself. "Hey, you know, messy bun
Mhm.
and like smudge mascara," however you want to like,
Yeah.
"Hi friend, here you are. What do you got to tell me today?"
Mhm,
Okay. And
mhm,
like hearing that part of yourself, making that part of yourself feel heard and safe
mhm,
and
mhm,
signaling that safety
mhm,
of,
mhm.
okay, I hear you. you're here, you're
Mhm.
here to help me.
Yeah.
Thanks. Not a great time right now, but I can come back to, I can come back to you
Yeah.
later, whatever that is. But I think
Yeah.
I think the most powerful tool is just understanding that like we have the ability to like to
Right.
negotiate that relationship.
We do, we do. And it's a muscle though. It's a new muscle to and it's a rewiring. And
Yeah.
that takes work, right?
Yeah.
That's like paving a new path that like you've been paving one path for a very long time, right? And our
Yeah.
brain will prioritize taking the path that's most familiar,
Yeah.
especially in a moment where we feel triggered or they feel like there's a threat. What's the most familiar path? What do we do in these situations? Oh yeah, we worry. We think about all the like like in Inside Out 2. We think about all the potential bad scenarios, right?
Yeah.
Or we numb, or we avoid, or whatever the case might be. And to take a new path and rewiring, which is absolutely possible, right? Totally possible. But it's like taking a different path. And like now, like there's trees and rocks and it's not so smooth and it's going to there's that pull for homeostasis how we used to do things and you'll
Yeah.
get pulled back in and that's part of
100%.
it and that's
That's
part of it.
evolution, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The coping mechanisms that, that you go back to. I mean, I feel like I you can you there's a you can know better. Great. That's like step number 1 is like, okay, there's something different. I can have a different relationship with these anxious thoughts. I don't have to beat myself up every time I have them and try to figure out a way to not have them and just like push them away. That like step number 1 is acknowledging, okay, I can have this different relationship.
Mhm.
And, even just saying, hey, I actually want to have this different relationship. Like that's
Right.
usually powerful.
So what you just said there is actually really important because a part of this is just about exposure. It's like exposing ourselves to this new way of responding to this. First, I think the exposure is actually just like creating the space, like just noticing the trigger and just like taking a beat to create a margin or a space between the trigger and your response. That's the first like little muscle of like that we have to kind of build out. And then it's this exposure to doing something that feels like that anxiety feels like is a risk. And again, sometimes anxiety is like, this is risky. And I'm like, oh, you're right. I should put my seatbelt on. Or like, oh, right. Like I should call my doctor and ask about this.
Yes.
Like, thank you for
Yeah.
that data.
Yeah.
But there's also those risks that are actually meaningful risks, right? Like telling somebody that you're struggling and like reaching out to get help,
I agree.
and and what we want to do, what we have to do there is actually expose ourselves to something new. And with that exposure, one of two things is going to happen. Either nothing bad's going to happen. And then our brain's like, oh, okay, let me now wire that experience now that
Mhm.
I've exposed myself to it. Or sometimes it's something does happen, right? Like maybe you have a consult call with a therapist and they say something that feels really invalidating and you're like,
Uh,
or their schedule isn't going to work with yours, or they're out of network or too expensive for what your resources will allow for. And so quote unquote, the bad thing happens, right? But then what we also hopefully get to experience through that exposure is that we survive it. Because what anxiety at the end of the day is afraid of is death, literally, is like that
percent.
we will not survive
Yeah.
this. Like we will like be alone and die, right? Like
Yep.
when you really take an anxious thought and you keep going, well, if that was the case, what would that mean? Well, if that was the case, what would that mean? At the core, it's usually like being alone and death. Like
Uh,
ultimately, that's anxiety's priorities to keep you alive. But if we expose ourselves and we see that either the bad thing doesn't happen, or maybe even something meaningful happens, or that something does happen, but we survive it,
yeah.
that exposure has to be wired now as a new experience. And the more that we're able to rewire this, that muscle gets stronger. It becomes easier to have this new relationship in response to anxiety.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I feel like one of the things that has been the most helpful thing that has happened to me as a parent is actually to have a child get a bad medical diagnosis.
Mm,
It
mhm.
was like, I kn- you because before it happens to you, you're just like, you're like, you want to live in like it couldn't happen, like nothing bad. My child couldn't be sick. They couldn't have issues. They
Yeah.
couldn't need procedures, whatever. And then there's you get the like the warning, like, oh, we think that there might be something here, like there's something wrong. And then you're in this like zone of waiting for results. Like I call this like the
Mm.
diagnostic, like the diagnostic gray zone. Somebody signaled that there's something
Yeah.
wrong, but you don't have an answer yet. And going through that, my husband us going through that, and then getting the bad news, and like, obviously the tears and all the upset of like that diagnosis, and then just being like, okay, well now we put one foot in front of the other, and like we walk through this, and
Mhm.
having that experience of being like, oh, okay, I bad
Mm.
things can happen, and I
Yeah.
can put one foot in front of the other, and I feel like I was before, in pregnancy, and, even before that, it's like that you're so afraid of that thing, and once you get there, you're like, "Okay, this sucks, like, I don't really want this thing, but here
Mm.
I am," and I almost felt like I felt better once we had a diagnosis, and it was
Mhm.
like, "Okay, now we just deal with it," than the,
Mhm.
like, "What if? What if?"
Mhm.
No.
Absolutely. And I think, this part of us, similar to like a child when, like, let's say a child falls and like you look at them and you're like, nothing's broken, and like I don't know, like I know I received this when I was little, and maybe, and I'm sure I've done it before with my kids, where it's just like, you're fine, like, and because you want to assure them like, we're
Yeah,
fine, you're fine, like nothing bad
yeah,
is happening, or like, you can walk into this party, like it's, these people, or like,
yeah,
you're that slide will be fun, just try it, you're fine, it's
yeah,
okay, like stop
yeah,
worrying. And so there's that moment with a child, and I think with this part of us, that when we finally get down, when we get down to its level, or to their level, and we like see them, and we validate, like, something about this doesn't feel right, right? Like something about this is scary, or something about that really hurt. I believe you. I'm
yeah,
listening. Initially, there might be like this increase in like, yeah, like you find, like, so we might start to feel like, okay, if I'm going to validate this, like this part of me is real, and like validate its existence, basically, like not validate that like the fear is real, but validate this part of me's existence, or like that the child is real and has these real feelings inside their body. There might be this moment for us of like, you see me. Ah,
yeah,
and then it might feel a little overwhelming at first, right? Like their response, or this part of us, like feels bigger. But then there's this settling. Then there's the
yeah,
like, okay, you're listening now. You're
yeah,
here. Like,
yeah,
you believe me. Okay. And then there's this like settling that happens, where now we're in a position where we can actually, this part of us is trust us. Like, really what we're
yeah,
trying to build is trust. Like, for
yeah,
the part to trust that self, like, has it,
yeah,
that myself had that, like, this, that I have got this, right? Like,
yes,
I'm listening and I can make a decision, value informed, with the data that they've offered, and make the right decision for me, for us, or at least take the next step, whatever I have agency around, right? Get more information if needed, or get help or support if it's going to be hard, whatever the thing is. But yeah, it's there's this really cool parallel process that I think happens with the kind of parenting support that I think that we're all like, absorbing these days, and actually like what the different parts of us are also needing from ourselves too.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love that idea of just, and I think it can be really, really hard to do, but acknowledging like that the core of the fear, right? Like I don't know, I personally have always found that there is, when I just like kind of look at what I'm really scared about, and like just look at it, there's afterwards, I have not solved the thing. Like when I went into my third birth, I was really truly terrified of dying. I just was. And it was more than I had been in my other ones.
Mhm.
And when I really sat down and was like, yeah, I'm like afraid of leaving my kids behind. That's what this is all about.
Mhm.
Um, I was like, there's nothing, I haven't done anything to like reduce that risk other than just, I haven't done anything, but it was like, there
Yeah.
was this like, okay, that's what's going
Yeah.
on. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. It's just it's the acknowledgement of like the underlying fear of the context. And I think that context to me always supports compassion. Like if I sit with my anxiety and I'm like really curious about like the context of why this is something that we are feeling
Yeah.
triggered by or worried about, it almost always like bridges compassion for me. Like, well, that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot like with your fear of your third birth, it's like there's a lot more to live for now. Like there's,
Yeah.
these so yeah, I think
And
that
you can clearly imagine how I could have, how you can go the opposite.
yeah,
Say, I'm an OBGYN. This is the third time I've given birth. I'm completely, I should just be excited about this baby coming here. What's wrong with me? What am I worrying about?
right.
You can also make a logical argument why you shouldn't be feeling that way. But that's the thing is, and like, there is no, when it comes to these feelings,
Yeah.
you know, logic doesn't always touch that.
Yeah, right. And I think that there's an approach to therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy that is also evidence-based and it can be really supportive for many people. But one thing that I found with a lot of the clients I was working with, right, who had kind of lived with anxiety in this kind of more extreme role for a really long time is that the in cognitive behavioral therapy, a lot of it is around like challenging the thoughts, and I think that some folks can do that and move forward in a way that feels like right for them. But a lot of my clients were like getting actually more into this like tug of war battle with their thoughts, the more they were
Yeah.
trying to like challenge them. And so the minute we kind of like accepted that this is a part of us
Yeah.
and started responding to it and relating into it in these other ways, I found that it's like they dropped the tug of war rope, the tug of war rope, right? And were able to actually develop a new relationship with this part of themselves that, throughout parenthood was going to be there, right? And sometimes in helpful ways and sometimes deliver message in unhelpful ways. But it was just really around developing a new relationship with their parts that I found my clients really began to like see and feel the difference
Yeah.
in their minds and in their lives.
Yeah, because I mean, you're teaching your clients how to be kinder and gentler and more loving to themselves. And like
Right.
that's isn't that that's a superpower at the end of the day. Like having that
Yeah.
beautiful relationship with yourself is like, we really have that hasn't necessarily been modeled for us as
No.
kids,
Yeah.
especially not as girls, right? Like
Yeah.
as girls, we were just like it was the opposite. So
Yeah.
it's really beautiful that,
Yeah.
the work that you do and bringing that to us and sharing, your perspective and some of these tools and thoughts. I'm so appreciative of it. And I know that I don't know if you have this beautiful practice where you have like-minded therapists. Can you tell us a little bit more about your practice and are you just in California right now?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a group of us, we're all moms and trained in the approaches that I named today, internal family systems, acceptance and commitment therapy, EMDR. We are licensed in California. And so we're a virtual practice. So people can live anywhere in California and we can work with them. But yes, in the state of California. And then if you want, I could share also. I have a blog post on my website about how to find a therapist that takes a similar approach.
Yeah,
and so,
I love that. Yes,
um,
please.
and in your area, right? Because I obviously not all of your listeners are going to be based in California.
Yeah.
And so I want to make sure that they are able to get support too. And so, yeah, I can send that as a resource to your listeners as well, just so that they kind of have. I think when you're trying to find a therapist, it can feel really overwhelming to know, like, okay, I follow these people maybe
I
on
know you're
social
like
media
you
and like,
mentioned all of these modalities, and I think, yeah,
Mhm.
some people know what they are, but a lot of people don't.
Right. And so to have kind of something to kind of go off of when you're doing this search and some guidance on like how to find these providers, I think it can be really helpful because otherwise it can feel like very overwhelming when you see all the different options out there.
I love that. So we will definitely include a link to that. And then can you tell us where to find you on social media and the website for your practice as well?
Yeah, so the website is drcassitymft.com. And then I'm on Instagram and TikTok as at Dr. Cassidy. And I also have my podcast, Holding Space, where we talk about all of these things in all the different ways, how this all shows up relate, in feeding our children. My most recent episode is perfectionism and feeding your kids, right?
Well,
So
that's
it's
a
like, how
big
does
one.
anxiety and perfectionism show up there, right? I've got episodes in there on postpartum rage. You and I have some amazing episodes in there as well. So, I would encourage folks to go, if they're podcast listeners, to go check Holding Space out too.
Yeah, it's a wonderful podcast. I love your podcast. And also if you I don't think I haven't seen one in a little bit, but Dr. Cassidy used to do these incredible reels where
My
she
skits, yeah.
there's skits where I know we like so cool where you like personified like the
Yes.
anxiety or the perfection. Oh, it was so good, you guys. It's so
Yeah,
good.
yeah. But if you go on and you scroll back, you'll find those.
You'll
There with
see you'll see her in some outfits and
yeah,
they're
acting out my
phenomenal.
anxiety.
Yeah. I love it. Well, thank you so much for being here with us. And yeah, thank you everybody for listening. And yeah, we'll include those links and yeah, have a lovely day, everyone. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Bye.